We once believed that history was a story, a single unfolding narrative about progress, freedom, and reason. Every generation thought it was writing a new chapter in that book. But what if the story has already ended and we just kept turning the pages, mistaking motion for meaning? Today, meaning feels fractured. Millions of micro-truths flicker across our screens, each promising relevance, none offering coherence. AI curates not only our feeds, but our desires, our sense of time, even our idea of what matters. And yet, behind this digital noise, there's a quiet nostalgia, a longing for one big story again. A story that could explain everything, hold it together, make it make sense. That's where Jean-François Lyotard steps in. In 1979, he published The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge, a title that sounded bureaucratic, but detonated philosophy. It wasn't a prophecy, it was a diagnosis, a warning about what happens when knowledge becomes information. Lyotard asked the question that still defines our century. What happens to truth when knowledge becomes data? His answer was disarmingly simple and devastating. Simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward metanarratives. With that line, he didn't just name an era, he revealed its fracture. The Enlightenment had promised emancipation through reason, Marxism through revolution, science through progress. Each offered what Lyotard called a grand récit, a story that claimed to give history, direction, and legitimacy. But by the late 20th century, after wars, totalitarianisms, and the rise of digital systems, those stories had lost their authority. Their language no longer convinced, and the world, instead of collapsing, reorganized itself. Power stopped speaking through ideology. It began to speak through data. The question shifted from what is true to what works, from meaning to performance, from philosophy to system logic. Lyotard called this new condition la performativité, the rule of optimization, the measure of truth by efficiency. And that's why, decades later, his thought feels prophetic. Because we now live in a world ruled not by priests or philosophers, but by metrics, dashboards, and algorithms that promise salvation through performance. So let's begin where his diagnosis begins. What did Lyotard really mean by the postmodern condition? If meaning still matters to you, stay with me, subscribe, and let's question the stories we still live inside. When Lyotard spoke of the postmodern condition, he wasn't describing an artistic fashion or a passing cultural mood. He was naming a shift in the very structure of knowledge, in how truth is produced, legitimized, and circulated once machines begin to process information faster than humans can think. The 1970s marked the dawn of a new rationality. Computers left laboratories and entered universities, governments, corporations. Knowledge ceased to live in books or in human dialogue. It became a networked commodity, stored, transmitted, and evaluated by systems. Lyotard saw it before almost anyone else. He realized that information technology wouldn't just change how we work, it would redefine what we mean by truth itself. Because in this new order, truth no longer depends on consensus, on people agreeing that something is true. It depends on systemic performance, whether a statement functions, whether it can be stored, transmitted, computed, and used. He called this logic la performativité, performativity. As he wrote, the performativity of knowledge is the principle of its legitimation. That means Knowledge is now justified not by meaning, but by optimization, by how well it performs within a system. In modernity, knowledge was legitimated by grands récits, by stories of reason, progress, or emancipation that told us why truth matters. In postmodernity, legitimation shifts. Statements are justified not by their place in a universal story, but by their ability to function within the network. Lyotard also drew a crucial distinction between savoir and information. Knowledge carries sense and requires interpretation. Information carries function and requires transmission. When information infrastructures dominate, the criterion of truth merges with the criterion of use, and knowledge risks dissolving into pure operational output. That's why he wrote, "The status of knowledge is altered as societies enter the post-industrial and postmodern age." This isn't just theory. We see it every day. A researcher is valued by citations, not discoveries. A student by grades, not understanding. A person by followers, not depth. What counts is what can be counted, and what cannot be counted quietly disappears. That's Lyotard's performativity made visible. Truth becomes whatever performs well inside the system. He even compared it to a kind of linguistic capitalism, where every statement becomes a unit of exchange. In the economy of information, its value is no longer moral or philosophical. It's functional. And once knowledge enters this economy, the great narratives that once gave it purpose, reason, progress, emancipation begin to fade. Because those narratives relied on faith, not religious faith, but intellectual trust. The trust that knowledge leads to truth, that progress leads to liberation, that science leads to enlightenment. But when truth becomes a metric, that trust collapses. That collapse began long before the digital age. Nietzsche had already exposed it. The death of God was also the death of any absolute truth. If you want to see how this shift began, I explored it in When Nietzsche Killed Truth Before Derrida. Lyotard wasn't celebrating this shift. He was diagnosing it with the precision of a surgeon and the sadness of a humanist. He saw that when knowledge becomes information, meaning dissolves into performance. That is the postmodern condition, a world where truth is no longer justified by belief, but by efficiency. So before we ask what we've lost, we have to ask what exactly we once believed in. Because the next question is the one that defines the entire modern age. What were those grand narratives, and why did we believe them? Stay with me. That's where the real story begins. For centuries, humanity made sense of itself through stories bigger than life. Stories that gave history, direction, morality, and hope. Lyotard called them grands récits, grand narratives, vast frameworks that claim to explain everything, where we come from, why we suffer, and where we're going. Christianity told us history was a divine drama from creation to redemption. The Enlightenment replaced God with reason, a belief that knowledge would free us from superstition and lead to progress. Then came Marxism, promising liberation through revolution. Even humanism, with its faith in universal morality and rational subjects, was just a secular version of salvation, redemption without God. Each of these narratives gave history, a moral vector. Suffering gained meaning. Progress gained destiny. They were not just ideas, they were engines of legitimacy. They justified power, sacrifice, and institutions by claiming to serve something higher than the present. As Lyotard put it, knowledge in modernity is legitimated by grand narratives of emancipation. But notice something subtle. Every grand narrative rests on a promise that history has a goal, that reason will prevail, that truth will win, that we are part of a meaningful whole. And for a long time, that promise seemed self-evident. It became invisible, precisely because it was everywhere. Universities were built on it. Revolutions were justified by it. Science advanced under its moral banner. Knowledge itself became a moral project, the secular path to redemption. For Lyotard, this was the soul of modernity, the conviction that knowledge and progress speak the same language. It was a beautiful illusion, and a dangerous one, because once history failed to deliver its promised redemption, the whole architecture of meaning began to crack. The 20th century exposed those cracks brutally. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, totalitarian regimes, all born in the heart of rational modernity. The same Enlightenment that promised freedom produced bureaucratic domination and industrial destruction. Science built the bomb, progress leveled cities. After Hiroshima, the Enlightenment's dream of rational salvation could no longer be told with a straight face. And yet, those stories didn't vanish. They mutated to doubt. We still live among their shadows. The startup founder who believes innovation will save the world. The politician who insists history has a right side. The scientist who trusts that data will make us moral. The faith remains, only now. It runs without a God. Lyotard's insight here is razor sharp. The problem wasn't that grand narratives were false, but that they demanded universality. One path, one truth, one humanity. And when that claim to universality collapsed, we weren't left with no meaning. We were left with too many meanings, none of which could claim authority. That collapse created not nihilism, but a new kind of lucidity, an incredulity toward metanarratives, a refusal to believe that any one story can explain everything. Lyotard wrote, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward metanarratives. That incredulity, he said, is not cynicism. It's the first gesture of freedom. It opens space for many voices, for petits récits, small narratives that coexist, without being swallowed by one universal truth. But freedom always comes with a cost. When the great stories fall silent, something else rushes in to replace them. And that's where Lyotard's diagnosis becomes prophetic, because in the ruins of grand narratives, new forms of power begin to speak, quieter, procedural, digital. So the next question is inevitable. Why did those grand narratives collapse? And what filled the void they left behind? If this thought resonates, hit like, share it with someone who still believes in progress, and join me in the next chapter, where we'll see how the dream of reason turned into the rule of systems. Lyotard's century was a century of ruins, the ruins of ideologies, utopias, and the very belief that history could justify itself. He wrote in the late 20th century, when Europe was haunted by the echo of its own certainties. The Enlightenment had promised light, but its light cast the long shadows of colonialism, industrial exploitation, and bureaucratic genocide. Marxism had promised emancipation, but it hardened into a machinery of control. Science had promised progress, but progress built the bomb. The disasters of the 20th century didn't destroy reason, they exposed it. They showed what was hidden inside those grand narratives, their hunger for universality, their alliance with power, their silent demand that everyone must fit the same idea of truth. Lyotard saw this collapse, not as a failure, but as a revelation. The ruins revealed what the temples had concealed, that knowledge was never purely about truth. It was always entangled with power. That insight directly connects with Michel Foucault, who showed how power creates truth by defining what can be said and seen. If you want to understand how that mechanism works in everyday life, I unpacked it in Foucault's How Power Shapes What You Think Is Normal. As he put it, modernity legitimates knowledge through grand narratives of emancipation, but every legitimating discourse is already an exercise of power. Here, his thought meets Michel Foucault. For Foucault, power doesn't repress truth, it produces it. Whoever controls the conditions of discourse controls what can be known. Truth isn't discovered, it's organized, and Lyotard extended that insight into the technological age. Power no longer resides in ideology, it resides in systems, in databases, networks, and algorithms that decide what can circulate as true. The status of knowledge, he wrote, is altered as societies enter the post-industrial and postmodern age. This transformation was not just philosophical, it was infrastructural. Knowledge, once rooted in conversation and interpretation, became a matter of storage and speed. The faster information could be processed, the more true it appeared. Truth began to resemble efficiency. And here, Lyotard quietly converges with Derrida. Derrida showed that meaning is never fully present, that every truth carries within it a trace of absence, what he called la difference. Lyotard saw what happens when that instability ceases to be a philosophical insight and becomes a social condition, when the deferral of meaning becomes automated, embedded in the systems that govern what counts as knowledge. And that's exactly why Derrida matters here. He showed how the center of truth is always deferred by language itself. If you want to see how the very idea of truth gets deconstructed, watch Derrida Destroys the Idea of Truth. So the collapse of grand narratives was not only a crisis of belief, it was the birth of a new regime of knowledge. A regime where legitimacy is no longer granted by ideology, but by la performativité, by performance itself. A discovery doesn't need to be true, it needs to be publishable. A claim doesn't need to be right, it needs to be functional. Truth loses its metaphysical weight and becomes a metric. That's why Lyotard's critique feels prophetic. He wasn't just describing the end of modernity, he was diagnosing the beginning of algorithmic civilization, a world where meaning is produced, optimized, and monetized, but rarely believed. And when faith in universal truth collapses, a new kind of faith quietly takes its place. Faith in systems that promise neutrality. Faith in the smoothness of the interface. The collapse of grand narratives didn't silence humanity, it rewired it. We no longer believe in the story of salvation, but we believe in the story of efficiency. We no longer seek redemption in reason, we seek it in data. And so, the next question arises, perhaps the most urgent one today. What replaced the grand narratives once they fell apart? If you've stayed with me this far, leave a comment. Do you think technology liberated us, or just reprogrammed the old myths? Because in the next part, we'll explore how power survived the fall of ideology by learning to speak in the language of code. When the great stories lost their power to convince, the world didn't fall into silence. It began to speak in fragments. Lyotard called these fragments petits récits, little narratives, small and local stories that no longer pretend to explain everything. Each has its own logic, its own language, its own rules of truth. Science, politics, ART, ethics. Each now plays its own jeu de langage, its own game of language. In these games, there is no single referee, no meta rule that unites them. Truth becomes plural. And situated, it belongs to a context, not to eternity. At first glance, this feels liberating. No more dogmas, no single ideology claiming to speak. For all of us, knowledge becomes agile, diverse, alive. Every voice can find its space, if only for a moment. But Lyotard saw the danger in that freedom. Because when we lose the unifying story, we also lose the language of meaning itself. Without a shared horizon, understanding turns into translation, a constant movement between incommensurable worlds. In the modern age, knowledge was tied to ideals, progress, justice, enlightenment. In the postmodern age, it becomes tied to performance. And this is where Lyotard introduces one of his most unsettling insights. When knowledge becomes informational, power no longer needs belief, it needs output. He called this la performativité, the principle that defines our digital era, long before it arrived. To perform well means to function efficiently, to fit the system's logic, to generate measurable results. A statement is valid, not because it is true, but because it works, because it performs, reproduces, scales. As Lyotard warned, knowledge in the form of an informational commodity is already, and will be, the major stake in the world competition for power. He understood that once knowledge becomes digital, truth turns into performance data. The university starts to resemble a corporation. The philosopher becomes a node in a network. And understanding quietly transforms into output metrics. In such a world, meaning no longer dies from censorship, it dies from success, from the endless demand to produce, to publish, to optimize. When every idea must justify itself by its utility, the question why disappears, only how remains. This is Lyotard's paradox. The fall of grands récits didn't end our desire for them, it simply changed their form. The faith in reason became faith in code. Ideology returned, as infrastructure and neutrality became the new theology. We scroll through infinite feeds, believing we're free, yet still craving a story. That could tie it all together. So perhaps, the grand narratives never died. They just migrated from the pages of philosophy to the circuits of the machine. And that leads us to a disturbing question, the one Lyotard could only glimpse. But we're now living inside it. How does big data create new meta-narratives? And what happens when algorithms become the new storytellers? If this thought resonates, hit the bell, share this video, and join me in the next part, where we'll explore how information itself became a new faith and why every dataset hides a theology. The fall of old ideologies didn't end humanity's hunger for total explanations. It simply changed their syntax. Where philosophy once spoke of reason, progress, and revolution, today it speaks in numbers, in data, analytics, and prediction. The new meta-narrative doesn't begin with a prophet or a philosopher. It begins with a server. It doesn't promise salvation, it promises optimization. And its gospel is simple: data never lies. In this sense, big data isn't just a technology, it's a new theology. It offers what every grand narrative once offered: a way to turn chaos into coherence, a way to make the world measurable and therefore manageable. Everything becomes quantifiable, comparable, calculable. And in that transformation, the algorithm quietly replaces the oracle, the divine voice that once said, "Let there be light," now whispers, "Let there be metrics." Lyotard foresaw this logic long before the internet existed. He wrote, "The computerization of society will transform the nature of knowledge." He meant that once knowledge is stored and processed by machines, its value will be shaped by the same logic that governs machines, the logic of efficiency. The question shifts from "is this true?" to "can this be computed?" That sounds technical, but it's profoundly metaphysical. Because when the worth of knowledge depends on its computability, everything that cannot be measured, intuition, ethics, ambiguity begins to fade. We start to believe only what can be counted, and what cannot be counted begins to seem unreal. Here, the line between Lyotard and Foucault becomes clear again. For Foucault, power once spoke through institutions, the church, the clinic, the prison. For Lyotard, it now speaks through systems, databases, networks, and algorithms. They no longer forbid discourse, they format it. Power becomes procedural. And so, a new metanarrative emerges, not about salvation, but about computation. It tells us that information will save us, that enough data will reveal the truth, that artificial intelligence will finally correct human error, bias, and chaos. But this isn't liberation, it's recursion, the same structure of belief that once belonged to religion and ideology returns under the sign of neutrality. We no longer confess to priests or philosophers, we confess to interfaces. We no longer believe in divine omniscience, we believe in machine learning. The language has changed, but the function remains the same: to turn uncertainty into order, belief into data, difference into prediction. As Lyotard warned, every system that claims to explain everything inevitably begins to govern everything. Big data doesn't just describe the world, it prescribes it. It doesn't mirror reality, it produces it. The feed becomes the new scripture. The algorithm, its invisible author. What began as a postmodern age of fragments has quietly become a new modernity of control. The network promises pluralism, but rewards conformity. It claims to empower individuality, yet it trains our preferences until they align with its code. The old Enlightenment dream of universal knowledge has not died. It has migrated into circuitry. Universality has become computability, and the new God no longer speaks in words, it speaks in numbers. So, beneath the glow of our screens, a darker question begins to rise. Perhaps the most unsettling one yet. Is the algorithm the new God? If you feel that question, don't scroll just yet, because in the next part, we'll see how Lyotard's warning meets our daily lives, where faith in truth has quietly turned into faith in systems. Every age worships in its own language. Ours speaks in code. Power today no longer persuades, it formats. Norms are written not in doctrines, but in workflows, protocols, and dashboards. We call it automation. Lyotard would call it la performativité, the rule of efficiency, disguised as truth. Under such conditions, responsibility disperses. Everyone just follows the process, while no one judges. And here, Lyotard's performativity meets Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil, not as the will to harm, but as the abdication of judgment in the name of procedure. We once believed that truth descended from heaven. Then we believed it emerged from reason. Now, we believe it lives in data, in the silent calculations that decide what we see, what we want, what exists. The algorithm has become our new mediator between the world and understanding, a machine that filters visibility itself. We no longer kneel before temples, but before dashboards. We no longer pray, we search. Each query becomes a small act of faith that somewhere an invisible intelligence already knows the answer. We refresh the feed the way earlier generations turned the pages of scripture, seeking signs, patterns, promises that the world still makes sense. The algorithm doesn't need belief, only attention. And attention has become the new form of prayer. This is why Lyotard feels prophetic. He saw that when grand narratives collapse, they don't die, they mutate. Belief in universal truth returns as belief in universal computation. Where theology once promised divine order, data now promises systemic coherence. Where religion offered salvation from ignorance, algorithms offer salvation from uncertainty. But hidden in that promise lies a paradox. The more total the system becomes, the less space remains for meaning. The algorithm never doubts, never hesitates, never interprets. Its logic is pure performativity, the very logic Lyotard warned against. Performativity, he wrote, is the principle of legitimation by efficiency, and it risks substituting the question of truth with that of effectiveness. In earlier times, heresy meant questioning God. Today, it means questioning the system. Doubt has become a form of invisibility. What cannot be processed is filtered out. Power no longer punishes dissent, it deletes it. The feed doesn't silence, it simply fails to show. Foucault would call this a new regime de vérité, a regime of truth that operates not through ideology, but through infrastructure. It shapes us, not by persuasion, but by participation. We surrender agency because it feels efficient. We obey, not out of fear, but out of convenience. And Derrida would remind us, meaning requires delay, hesitation, the space of interpretation. But algorithms are allergic to delay. They collapse time into immediacy, and with it, the possibility of reflection. They make the world appear faster, but not clearer. So, yes, perhaps the algorithm is the new God, not because it loves, or judges, or forgives, but because it decides what can exist within its domain. It creates visibility itself, and in the digital age, to be invisible is to be unreal. But this divinity comes without transcendence. It offers no redemption, only relevance. It rewards not faith, but activity. To exist is to perform. To disappear is simply to stop producing data. Lyotard's condition, postmodern, thus reaches its theological climax. The death of one God has not led to freedom, but to the rise of countless small gods, of calculation, each living in the circuits of our devices, each deciding silently what deserves to be seen. And so, the question returns, sharper, quieter, more human. What happens to truth when everything becomes data? If this part resonated with you, pause for a moment before scrolling, because in the next section, we'll ask something even harder. When truth itself becomes computation, can we still When everything turns into data, truth no longer needs to be argued. It only needs to be processed. For Lyotard, this is the most dangerous illusion of all, the illusion of neutrality. Data appears objective, precisely because it hides the structure that selects it. Every dataset has an author, every metric has a motive, every algorithm has a politics. But in a culture addicted to efficiency, we stop asking the most human question: who speaks through the code? La performativité is not crude utilitarianism. It is a cybernetic rationality, a logic of optimization that governs how statements survive. They are selected, stored, and circulated only insofar as they stabilize the goals of the system. the more governance is delegated to metrics, the more legitimation collapses into procedure. Truth, once a dialogue between minds, becomes an operation between machines. It no longer lives in understanding, but in correlation. If enough patterns repeat, the system calls it true. What cannot be measured quietly ceases to exist. And this is not a conspiracy, it's a logic. And logic, once automated, becomes power. Foucault would say, the regime de vérité, the regime of truth, now functions without belief. The algorithm doesn't care whether we understand, it only cares that we respond. Engagement replaces conviction, clicks replace meaning. Here, Lyotard's diagnosis collides with Baudrillard's prophecy. Baudrillard warned that in the age of simulation, signs no longer reflect reality, they replace it. Lyotard shows how that replacement becomes legitimate. Once the system measures everything, its very performance becomes proof of truth. We no longer need to believe, we only need to interact. The result is a world of operational truths, temporary, adjustable, optimized for visibility. They don't require belief, only compliance. The feed doesn't ask whether we agree, it trains us to react. And in that constant motion, understanding becomes obsolete. Derrida would call this the final difference, meaning displaced, not by language, but by speed. When everything updates in real time, nothing lasts long enough to be interpreted. Truth becomes liquid, its flow regulated by algorithms of relevance. And yet, in that liquidity, something essential is lost, the human ability to pause, to interpret, to dwell in ambiguity. For Lyotard, this ability, to think without guarantees, to endure uncertainty, is the last form of resistance left after the fall of metanarratives. When truth becomes computation, thought itself becomes a luxury. So the question is no longer whether truth exists, but whether we can still experience it. Because truth, unlike data, requires vulnerability. It needs time, attention, and the courage to hesitate. Without that, knowledge may continue to expand, but understanding will keep disappearing. And that leads to Lyotard's most human question, one that turns philosophy back toward us. Can we still think without a grand narrative? If this part made you pause, don't rush to the next video, reflect, comment. Because in the next chapter, we'll ask whether thought can survive without the stories that once held it together. To think without a grand narrative means to think without a safety net. No universal truth to lean on, no collective story to justify our choices. Only fragments, languages, perspectives, temporary agreements that dissolve the moment we try to make them absolute. For Lyotard, this isn't despair, it's maturity. The modern world wanted certainty, a single map of meaning. The postmodern world forces us to live without one. And perhaps that is what adulthood looks like on a civilizational scale. The ability to act without guarantees. This is what Lyotard called penser sans garantie. Thinking without guarantees, not to rebuild the broken idols of universality, but to listen to the petits récits, the small narratives that surround us, scientific, political, artistic, personal, each with its own rhythm, its own truth. He called this a pragmatique des différences, a pragmatics of differences, a way of thinking that seeks not to unify, but to coexist. And yet, can we really live like that? Can we bear a world without a center, where truth never arrives, but only circulates? Lyotard knew how fragile this freedom is, because even as we reject universality, we continue to crave it. We want coherence, we want belonging, we want the story to make sense. That's why every liberation risks becoming a new dogma. Even incredulity toward metanarratives can harden into its own metanarrative, a belief that disbelief is enough. Lyotard's answer is subtle. To think without a grand narrative does not mean to stop seeking meaning. It means to seek meaning without domination, to think in plural, but still to think, to resist both totality and nihilism. The cultural theorist Stuart Hall once echoed this spirit when he spoke of thinking without guarantees. It's a form of intellectual courage, the readiness to navigate uncertainty, to accept that truth may exist only in the tension between voices. Perhaps that is what philosophy becomes after the death of universals, not a system, but a form of listening. The postmodern mind, then, is not the skeptic who refuses to believe, but the listener who refuses to silence. Someone who understands that difference is not fragmentation, but the very condition of thought. And maybe that is the only kind of wisdom still possible in the age of algorithms. But even if we learn to live without grand narratives, one question still remains, quiet, persistent, almost sacred in its simplicity. Do grand narratives still rule us, only in another form? If this reflection speaks to you, share it, comment, or rewatch the earlier parts of this series. Because in the final section, we'll return to Lyotard's central paradox and ask whether the myths we thought we escaped are now ruling us again, only written in the language of code. Lyotard never said that grand narratives disappeared. He said, we stopped believing in them, and that may be the greatest illusion of all, because belief doesn't vanish, it migrates. It moves from philosophy to technology, from truth to data, from ideology to interface. The Enlightenment stream of universal reason now lives in the logic of the algorithm. The Marxist faith in progress has become the cult of innovation. Even religion survives, not in cathedrals, but in dashboards and metrics that promise transcendence through optimization. We think we've escaped the old myths, but we're simply living inside new ones, written in another language. They no longer tell us what is true. They decide what is visible. They no longer preach salvation. They offer relevance. And yet, their structure remains the same. Each claims to make sense of everything. Lyotard's final gesture is not rejection, but resistance. He calls it la guerre aux tout, the war on totality. Not a war to destroy meaning, but to keep it alive through difference. To distrust every voice that says, this is the only truth. To protect the fragile plurality that keeps thought breathing. Let us wage a war on totality. Let us activate the differences. Maybe this is what philosophy must become after the fall of all systems. Not a monument to knowledge, but a practice of vigilance. A refusal to let anyone's story, anyone code, claim the right to define reality for us. And yet the temptation remains, the comfort of coherence, the promise of one final explanation. Because behind every search, every metric, every click, there still hides the same ancient desire to find a story that tells us who we are and why we're here. So perhaps the grand narratives never ended. They simply changed address, moved from books to servers, from pulpits to platforms. That migration from meaning to media is what I explore throughout my playlist, Philosophy in the Digital Age. It traces how thinkers like Derrida, Foucault, and Baudrillard still shape the invisible systems we live inside And yes, they still rule us, quietly, invisibly, through the systems we trust the most. Critics like Habermas warned that Lyotard's incredulity risks normative paralysis if there's no shared ground. How can we ever criticize domination? Lyotard's answer wasn't relativism. It was ethics, not consensus, but vigilance. Not rebuilding one discourse, but keeping open the spaces where heterogeneous voices can still speak. So the question is not whether grand narratives exist. The question is whether we can still think outside them. Because if the algorithm now writes our stories, who then is writing us? Maybe Lyotard's prophecy was never about the end of meaning, but about its exile. Meaning didn't die. It scattered across screens, systems, voices, codes. It hides not in depth, but in the flicker of connections, in the small resistances of thought that refuse to be optimized. Perhaps our task is no longer to rebuild the grand stories, but to guard the silence, in which smaller ones can still be heard. Because every age believes it has reached the end until someone begins to ask again. And when that question returns, in a whisper, a glitch, a human pause, between signals, philosophy begins once more. There's one question that stays with me after Lyotard. If power today works through systems and metrics, maybe that's where the banality of evil hides now, not in cruelty, but in compliance, not in ideology, but in procedure. I'm thinking of making a separate video on that, connecting Lyotard, Foucault, Baudrillard, and Hannah Arendt to ask how moral thought survives in times of automation. If that's a direction you'd like me to explore next, let me know in the comments. That's how I understand what questions still matter to you. And if meaning still matters to you, stay with this channel. Because this isn't the end of the story. It's just another fragment in the endless conversation about truth.